Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about let me start this over again. Thank you for coming. Today's talk is Read the Fantastic Manual, Writing Security Docs People Will Actually Read. Our speaker is Breanne Boland. Breanne Boland is a product security engineer with the security partnerships team at Gusto. Before moving into security, she was a site reliability engineer and an infrastructure engineer who did work in healthcare and GovTech. And if there's any questions, please post them on Slido with hashtag BSidesSF 2022, if there's time. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Hello, B-Sides. I have not spoken in front of actual people in somewhere between 28 months and 84 years in a very old lady on the Titanic.gif kind of way. It's really good to see all of you. This is thrilling in all of the connotations of that. Hi, I'm Breanne. Hello. To tell you a little bit about me, as mentioned, I spent some time in SRE land and infrastructure. Before that, for a bunch of years, I was a professional editor, which is why I have many opinions about many things you're about to learn about. And you're also going to see my UX background poke out here and there. It informs a lot of this stuff. I'm also doing a signing of a book I contributed to called Reinventing Cybersecurity at 3 p.m. up at the B-Sides table in the participant room with my excellent colleague, Carla. So we have free books. They're amazing books. I hope you come see us. And in the vein of meeting lots of different kinds of learning styles where they are, there is a blog post version of this talk at breanneboland.com if you like reading along. And I also linked it on Twitter. And if you're a person who posts stuff and hashtags and tags people, I live for that. You'll make me very happy, so feel free to go wild. So what are we going to talk about for the next 23 or so minutes? We are going to talk about figuring out what kind of documents to write, how to write it, where to put it once you've written it, how to socialize it, how to evaluate it, and then what to do next. And to give you a little context for the kind of documentation I'm talking about here, I'd say it applies for small companies up to companies of maybe 5,000 people, basically just shy of where a company can pay for a comms team and a content strategist. And the stuff I'm going to talk about it's important there, but it's less often that engineers are pressed into writing documents there, so it comes up a little bit less. But let's dive in. First, we need to figure out what we need to write. And for that, we need to spy on our colleagues. We're going to start by eavesdropping. If it's safe for you to go back into an office, that's amazing. I used to love sitting in the middle of the office and just figuring out what people didn't know yet by listening to them talk. For us, a little more right now, it is Slack. Ideally, you have a channel that's something like Ask Security that says, hey, people with security questions, why don't you pop in? And people are, operators are standing by waiting to answer your questions. And the great thing about this is it also gives you a place to collect those questions so you know what's going on. We also need to check views on existing docs. Confluence and Google Drive both do this in different ways. A warning, this can be gutting, especially if you're the person who wrote some of the existing documentation to look at something that you remember spending 2 weeks on, and 17 people have looked at it. But the thing is, we need to know, or else we're not going to do this right. We also need to talk to people who depend on this work, who will be honest with us. Ask them, are the docs out there? Are they written the right way? Are they covering the right material? Where are the gaps? People can tell you where you need to start. We also need to learn from the past. And incidentally, this is what I think of whenever I hear the phrase pick your brain. I think it is very gross, but I like this picture a lot. So, learning from the past. If we can, talk to the person who's responsible for all of the existing docs before, which might be you. But if it's not, you want to go and just get a sense of what has transpired. And if that person's no longer there, try to figure out why that is, because that might also be very instructional. We also want to figure out what docs have people traditionally shared, and also, just as important, what docs have people not shared? What do people not know exist, and why do they not know it exists when it's out there in a way that someone thought it was accessible and able to be found? Basically, we want to get a sense of the efforts of old and what's been done, because one thing that humans and engineers have in common is if we don't learn from the past, we will repeat it to death and keep screwing up. And while we're at the planning phase, remember to pace yourself. This is not a task where we're either trying to drink the ocean nor boil it. And the great news is that when we start putting some concentrated, specific effort into this, people will notice. A little effort goes a long way. If you put some love into something that has been a problem for a while, people will recognize it and be pretty psyched. The other good news, we are not aiming for perfection. Documentation is by its nature a fairly subjective thing that we're undertaking, so there's no way to get 100%. This is fantastic. The other thing I recommend, just to not burn yourself out, I like pursuing 2 questions at a time. This way you're not trying to answer literally everything with every bit of research you do. And also, it lets you find interesting connections between things. Way more than if you were going very single-mindedly and being like, today is only for this question and everything else must be ignored. So to recap, how do we know what to write? Listen to conversations, read the chat, ruthlessly exploit our colleagues' good-natured communication for our own devices. Check stats on existing documents just so you know what is actually being used and how. Ask around to see what's actually working and what isn't. And as you go through stuff, just work to answer 2 questions at a time. Once you answer one, you replace it and you keep on. So now that we have a sense of what to write, let's talk for a minute about what it means for a document to be good. I promised you UX. So it's a good document when it enables people to carry out the behavior that we want from them. It's not uncommon for docs to be like this super cute, very well intended, definitely the cats are going to work this way kind of food dish design, where you think it's doing one thing, but actually something else comes out the other end. But it's okay, we can get past this. We can get past this by building a better document. And one of my favorite ways to do this is by including everything that you can. I've just read way too many tech documents where just, this command or this detail gets left out because there are assumptions made about the reader that fundamentally don't work. So if you know something, just put it in there. There's no reason to withhold. It's commands, it's file locations, it's steps, all sorts of stuff. Just put it in there. Because if someone's trying to figure out what you're already trying to figure out, they need to know the same stuff that you do. We also want the doc to be a complete resource. Imagine there was an ill-fated offsite and everyone succumbed to food poisoning or COVID, We're writing for the survivor. We want to get Sigourney Weaver to safety and Alien with our doc. We want to tell her everything she needs to get this done and make things okay. And related to that, because it's not rare for a security doc to be talking to someone on a pretty rough day of work, docs need to be friendly, by which I mean not adversarial. It is important that the person reading the doc feels like the doc author is rooting for them. We have to be the people's cheerleaders. And to bolster that, docs should not use a vocabulary that's different than the user. We need to speak the user's language, and if we introduce new things, we need to explain them, either by expanding in a parenthetical, linking to something. We just need to get them to where we are. To that end, we need to be really targeted. So for every document I write, I have this at least in mind, if not written down. I am just writing this doc for this audience to describe this information for this purpose. So for example, I'm writing this doc for our front-end engineers to describe our preferred form libraries to avoid cross-site scripting. It tells you what's in there, you get a pretty good idea of how it's written, and you have an idea of maybe what is out of bounds and not so relevant. Or a little more ambitiously, I'm writing this doc for everyone to describe common phishing techniques for thwarting recent spear phishing attacks. That's a different vocabulary, a little hard to write. Or I'm writing this doc for that executive, and if you've had that executive, I think you're picturing them right now, to describe why we need this tool for upcoming budget planning. So who are you talking to? What are you trying to accomplish? It's great to write this at the top of the draft when you get started just so that you don't drift. Then you write it and you ask that person that you decided to aim for if this actually enables them to do what they need. And if not, it's time to iterate. So to sum up, how do we know a good document when we see it? It includes everything a person might need to know about the subject or process to get their job done. It's friendly, speaks the user's language, and it has an intended audience, information to be conveyed, and a stated purpose for existing. And this is how we know if we've hit our mark or not. So we know what to write, we know who we're writing to. How should we write it? For that, I have the perpetual security answer, I'm afraid. It depends. It always, always depends. There's so many possible kinds of docs. Your purpose will determine what you need to write. So for example, docs to solidify process. Playbooks, you had a thing happen, here's what to do. Maybe you got PII in the logs, common stuff. Here's what you do. You list out steps, here's who you talk to, here's what you need to change, here's what to do to make sure this doesn't happen in the future. With these especially, expect to refine it a few times, especially if you're writing for people who aren't familiar with this stuff but are suddenly immersed in it. Process docs, describing what a team does, describing something that people need to do from start to finish. And these can be either rarely used but really still important, or frequently used and you'll get a lot of information about it from people. And this kind of doc includes process flowcharts, which I will confess I have a bias. I kind of hate them because they often seem like the first, last, and only resort of attempting to convey information from teams that don't actually want to help you, and mostly they kind of wish you'd go away. So if it's the first thing a team throws at people, I get kind of leery. I just don't find them as accessible as people think, especially if it's a rat's nest of overlapping swim lanes. Kind of like this nightmare. This is what I found on Google when I searched terrible flowchart. So just imagine you have a task in front of you and a team just said, oh yeah, just check out our flowchart, you'll be fine. And then they hand you this. They hate you, and this is what we're trying to avoid. And if you must use one of these, and there are legitimate reasons, sometimes visual things are very useful, ask someone off your team who will depend on this flowchart if it works before you release it, because otherwise there are going to be big opaque parts that will read as very adversarial, and that is what we don't want to happen. Okay, this is the wordiest slide. I usually avoid this, but it's this nice grab bag of how to write tips, so I just wanted to bundle it together for easy pictures if one is inclined. So, keep it friendly like we discussed. Aim for informal language. It's best just because a lot of people, I don't know if you know this, have bumped into really unfriendly security people. And sometimes our job is to work to undo that. And this is one way. Like we said, explain all abbreviations and acronyms on first use, sometimes more than once if the document's kind of long. And while you're doing it, link generously, both internally to other documents, also externally. We like to reward the people who learn really deep. And you already looked at it, so why not just link it, because you know which the good resource is. We want to make it clear who is behind a doc. This helps just so that it de-anonymizes things, tells people who to reach out to if something's not going so well. We also want to chunk information with headers because some people like to skim. Some people Command F their way through life. I do sometimes, totally valid, and we want to support that. There are lots of different kinds of readers and lots of situations. And related to that, we don't ever want to assume someone's going to read the whole doc. Yeah, I know we make them lovingly. We pour all of our wordsmithery into it sometimes, or some of us nerds do. But you can't assume that everyone's going to take in your entire beautiful efforts, and that's all right. And related to that, a doc has to work separately of any supporting material. Sometimes it does make sense to make a beautiful interwoven suite of documentation to get people to a higher goal, but most likely they're just going to look at the part of it they need to get their ticket done that afternoon, and that's the end of it. Totally okay. If you're worried about attention spans, and it is something that people need to read from start to finish, do not underestimate the power of animal pictures and GIFs. It gives people a pause. It's a relief sometimes in the middle of a bunch of technical language. Hello, have you seen an axolotl lately? Maybe your soul needs it. That's something that we can give. And finally, include how to give feedback in every document. This can be comments, a link to chat, a survey, something like that. We want it to feel like it's going two ways. People are not reading this in isolation. They can tell us if stuff's working or not, and that's really important. End wordiest slide. So how do we write a document? First, you have to know what doc you're writing based on the purpose you figured out. Remember that your job is to explain, but also to be approachable in words. Act like each doc has to exist in isolation, because at least sometimes it will have to. And make it skim-friendly for people in a hurry. So now we've written it. Where do docs live? We are trying to avoid the digital version of this, which I suspect most of us have seen some version of. It has been my experience that there are always at least 2 doc repositories. Google Drive is often one just because so many people use G Suite. It's just there, and people are accustomed to it. Sometimes it makes sense to put things in both places. Probably not, though. So we just have to figure out which one makes sense as the go-to resource for people in need, and then aim our stuff there. We just also have to keep chat in mind. Chat is not documentation, but it is a very alive information repository. So just keep in mind how things get shared. It's sometimes going to be your job to share it in there to get the job done. And we have to keep in mind that governance works differently depending on where you end up putting your docs. How do we indicate a draft versus a final version, for instance? It all depends on where you decide things need to live. So we can learn this stuff through observation and asking, or we can learn by trying something, getting it wrong, and being corrected. And most likely this is going to happen, but that is great. That is information, and it's what we need. We also have to get a sense of how people look for information. Like, are they reliant on docs that are linked at the top of channels? Do they usually go searching? And this is something you really need to figure out at this point because it's going to play into the next step. So are they searching in Google Drive? Are they searching in Confluence? Does the title of the doc match the vocabulary? So going back to something I said earlier, the stellar thing, I promise, you're not going to find a perfect solution here. And if you find yourself ready to suggest the perfect document repository that you used at your previous job, if we can just buy it and bring it in, it's going to solve all of our problems, stop. Don't do that. I want you to remember the joke about now we have 24 JavaScript frameworks. It applies here too. Throwing more places to put information in is not supporting our users. Instead, you're looking for like a 75% solution. This is a very C's gets degrees kind of situation. In our case, the C is consistency. Just whatever you do, just pick it and stay with it. And it'll be really tempting. You're like, oh, if only no, just stay with it. And then you want to get actual information from the people depending on it before you change course. And when you do, communicate it and solicit feedback. So yeah, putting docs in the right place. We want to figure out all the places docs can live, figure out how and where people tend to search, figure out how they search, match it when you can, especially at first, and then stay the course until you have reason to shift. So yeah, now we're at the socialization part. Let's get your work out there, which means you have to talk to people, I'm afraid. Sometimes people end up in the putting words in a doc work because they're not thrilled to this, but sorry, it's what we have to do. Back to chat surveillance and participation. This can be automated stuff. It can also be just kind of haunting everywhere, engineering team channels, security channels, sometimes off-topic ones too. We're looking to see questions come out, even if they're not actually phrased as a question. We just want to be ready to give the answer that's needed when the question arises. And then there are meetings, which I know, we have lots of those, and I'm telling you to have some more. Sorry. It's very effective, though. I like going into team meetings and coming in with a document that lets me answer questions that have been asked before. It's very useful to be able to see when people light up when you actually got the details right in the thing you decided to make. And even more efficient is if you can get in those all hands, all engineering, all company, stuff like that. If you just snag a few minutes and you can promote what you did so that everyone has that first knowledge and first touch of what you've been putting your time into. And if all that fails, we're going to bribe people. This is also UX. It is okay to bribe people toward the behavior you want, especially when it comes to security, because this is really important. One of my favorites, because it is cheap and delightful, is stickers. And to that end, we're going to do an experiment. If you find me during the conference, and I'll be here all day tomorrow, and tell me one thing that you learned or liked from this talk, I will give you a security 8-ball sticker. And I will not pass this out outside of B-Sides. So this is for us. And for you, when you go like, hey, I think I see that pink and purple haired lady, and you come over, you too know that your behavior can be swayed. So, I'll see you later. Yeah, also good. Badges, people like flair, give them flair. Rewarding ambassadors by talking them up is really good. Give people public kudos, have a way to give public kudos. That's a really good idea. To talk people up to their managers, stuff like that. Coffee, even though coffee is free in offices and in the Bay Area, is often quite lovely, actually. Something about being enabled to go and get a treat is really effective. Because the thing is, it's not about the monetary value of this. Like, giving bonuses is above our pay grade. We don't get to do that. What it is making a compliment and appreciation more tangible and memorable. And this stuff is really good for that. Because it's going to take some time, and I'll just read this to you. Unfortunately, the DRY principle, which is don't repeat yourself, often a good principle in code, does not apply to humans. People need repetition as well as the same content applied in different ways. People don't learn math from only an explanation or only a textbook or only examples. It's everything combined. And that's what we're working with here. You're going to have to repeat yourself, and it's completely okay. People don't pick up on this stuff sometimes at first exposure. They need to hear about it when they need it. So it's more like you mention the doc, and then it gets brought up in Slack, and then someone says it in a meeting, probably you, a link from a colleague. If you feel self-conscious about repeating yourself, which most non-tedious people do, make a calendar. And then you can just do it on a schedule. You know exactly how much you've done it. You can't imagine it that it was way more. And then you have a sense of what you're doing, so it's much easier to iterate. So getting your work out there. Promote where the people are, chat meetings all hands, get comfortable with repeating yourself, totally okay. And if nothing else, bribe people into the behavior that you want. So how do we know our efforts are working? Do they even like me? Do they like our talks? The great thing is, because we are doing this, we are all winners. It's great. It's low stakes. We did the thing. Now we get to see what to do next. So to evaluate, we need to ask people regular check-ins, one-on-ones, do surveys. You don't want to overload on these. Some people have had bad experiences. Just make them regular, short, to the point. Check your metrics again. And finding a goal person is really good. And this can be a persona, but also just literally like Emily on the next team. Someone who has a bunch of needs that are unmet in documentation who you can check in with regularly and say, is this doing it, or do you need something else? We also need to review regularly. Quarterly is good for it. If that makes some dread curl in your stomach, it can be biannually, just as long as it happens at a regular cadence and happens. And that's where that feedback comes in. If people are regularly able to give like a thumbs up or thumbs down in a document or add a little comment, this gets way easier. And a little note, there are cultures that don't have great psychological safety, and that can mean that when you say, hey, tell me what you think about this doc, it can feel like a trap, and that is unfortunate. Changing that culture-wide, probably also above our pay grade, but we can make a little bubble of psychological safety by asking repeatedly, making it clear we want an opinion on the document, not our value as a security engineer, not my team's value, just the document and whether it meets the thing it's trying to do. And if you keep doing that and people see that you take their feedback and actually act on it, they will become gradually more forthcoming. It's tough, but we can't do this work unless people will actually tell us this information. And after that, ask around again, determine your needs, and map your future. Because we're trying to avoid this. This was at my BART station recently, and while I love old maps and find this adorable, if I were lost and saw this, I would be terribly upset. So we need to be on top of this stuff. So measuring success. Do your surveys, talk to people, get a sense of what you're doing, review stuff regularly, create at the very least a beautiful little bubble of psychological safety around you and your documents, and then start the next cycle. So here's what to take with you as you go back out into an actual physical security conference that we're all at. Meet people where they are, friendly language, explain anything that they might not have bumped into before. Maybe this means sometimes meetings instead of another Confluence doc, and sometimes it can mean GIFs instead of code snippets, depending on what your goal is. You have to be creative and try to meet people with their weird needs. Keep different readers and learners in mind. We are a good, beautiful, varied group, and we want to talk to everyone. Channels, we want to learn cultural norms, what they need, so find channels about communication. Just get a sense of how people speak, where they ask questions, what they need to know. See what people link and read, and then match and then iterate. And finally, please do not burn out. We are at especially high risk of that right now, and I don't want that to happen to any of us. So only answer 2 questions at a time, know who you're writing to. Sometimes cultural norms are great, sometimes we need to change them, figure out which one is which, and recognize your limitations and know that you can do wonderful, amazing things inside of them. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Breanne, for that talk. We had 2 questions on Slido, but there might not be the time. But I'll read out the questions and we can answer it afterwards.
Sounds good.
Thoughts on using GitHub as documentation repository with plain Markdown formatting? Good strategy or too limiting?
It depends on who you're dealing with. There are some really beautiful ways that Markdown can be displayed. And again, it's just consistency. If people know to look there, even if they're not people who will need to be able to submit a PR to update stuff, yeah, I've seen it done really well. There's no reason that can't work, especially if you understand that different teams have different comfort with that kind of thing.
All right. Thank you, Breanne, for presenting at BSidesSF. On behalf of the conference and the support of our speaker gift sponsor, Maltego, we want to give you this token of our appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Come see us at 3 p.m. Get a signed book.